Introducing the Middle Manager Switching Layout. This is a small 8x36-inch Z-scale layout that you can fit just about anywhere. A couple of years ago, I had a video on an executive switching layout, which was an 8x50-inch or so N-scale switching layout. And this layout essentially has the same track plan, but being Z-scale, you can fit it in about 3 feet instead of 4 feet of space. So even if you are a hard-working middle manager with limited desk space, you can probably still fit this layout on your desk for a quick operating session. I do plan to add structures and scenery to this layout, but you could build it just like this and leave it bare, so it's super easy to keep clean. Anyway, let's see how I built the layout to this point. Okay, so here you can see all the wood parts I cut out and used for this build. I used a roughly 8-inch by 36-inch clear pine plank for the base, then cut a backdrop board from 1/2-inch thick by 6-inch wide poplar, with a couple of angle pieces for the two sides. I cut a couple pieces off a 1/2-inch by 4-inch poplar board for the layout feet, and also some pieces off a 3/4-inch by 3/4-inch scrap of pine that I also had available. I used that to frame out the control box areas just so it would look a little bit nicer. And you can pause the video here to see the measurements if you want them, but really you can kind of build it however you'd like. Note that the 8-inch dimensional lumber is actually 7.5 inches and the 6-inch dimensional lumber is actually 5.5 inches wide, just because things are stupid like that. So no cutting was actually needed to make it those widths. Anyway, you see here the measurements I used to cut out the hole for the Roku hand controller, but just put whatever controller you want on the layout base and trace around it to get the actual size opening that you need. And you don't have to even cut a hole in the base for the controller. I just did that so it would be recessed into the base and look a little bit nicer. Plus, that does help it to stay in place, and so when you do move it around, it doesn't fall off. To cut out the hole, I drilled holes in each of the 4 corners and then cut out the area with my jigsaw. I also took my router and rounded over the front edge of the layout, but you could also just round off that edge with some sandpaper. And you don't actually even need to do that, but it just looks a little bit nicer, I think, and it makes it a little bit more comfortable to rest your hand on. Once I had the layout pieces cut out that I needed, I assembled them with some wood glue and some brad nails. The nails I used were longer than I needed, and so they actually went all the way through the layout base in places, and so I did have to come back and trim off the ends with a Dremel tool later on. I was framing out the area for the controller with that piece of scrap 3/4-inch pine that I had, but I had to chisel out a few notches for the cables so they would actually still be able to fit into the plugs on the back of the controller. Once I had that done, I glued and nailed those pieces of wood in place as well, and again trimmed off all the nail ends with my Dremel tool and sanded everything smooth. I gave everything another sanding the next day, wiped the layout clean, and then proceeded to paint everything a satin black color. Usually I stain the wood, but this time I decided to paint everything black. I painted the bottom of the base first, except for the bottom of the layout feet, and then flipped the layout over and painted the remainder of it except for the back panel. I wanted to paint that a sky blue color, and I figured that'd be easier to do if it wasn't black first. I came back and added a second coat of paint the next day, and then when that was dry, I masked off the areas for the back of the layout, then poured on some light blue and off-white paint onto the back of the layout, and just mixed those with my brush directly on the layout backboard itself. This way, when I spread the paint around, there was variation in color that was kind of subtle, but enough to make it look a little bit more realistic. Next, it was time to drill holes for the turnout wires as well as the track power lead. I'm only using one set of power leads to the track for now, and that does work fine so far, but I might eventually add 3 additional sets of wires to each of the track sections beyond the turnouts. Those will be easy enough to add on later if I need them. I also drilled holes through the trim pieces around the hole for the controller so I could run the wires back up to the plugs on the back of the controller. Some of the track pieces I originally used had uncoupling magnets in them, but I removed those track sections since I decided I wanted to do all the uncoupling manually. I added on regular sections of track and then cut the ends of each of the 4 track sections off so they would fit within the layout base area. I glued the track down with some tacky glue, but you could use regular PVA glue, hot glue, latex caulk, whatever else you wanted, and you could also just screw the track down if you wanted to do that. Once the glue had dried, I trimmed the layout over on its back and soldered the wires on the bottom of the layout. The holes I used to run the wires through weren't big enough to actually run the plugs through, so I did have to cut the plugs off, run the wires through the holes, and then solder the plugs back onto the original wires. I also cut off all the excess wire that I had so it wouldn't be a mess underneath the bottom of the layout. Once I soldered the wires, I protected the joints with some heat shrink tubing. You of course don't need to wire the turnouts since the layout is so small and they are easy enough to throw by hand, but since the Roku hand controller does have those built-in switches for the two turnouts, I figured I might as well use them, and so I did wire up the turnouts to the controller. With the simple wiring done, it was time to test out the layout. Everything worked great, and it's fun to use the built-in turnout controls on the Roku hand controller. Switching operations in Z-Scale are easier than you think, but they are even easier if you overweight all the cars. I haven't done that to all of them yet, but I have been gluing on some 3/8" nuts into each of the cars to give them a little bit of extra weight, which not only helps them track better, but it does make them more reliable to uncouple so you don't end up knocking them off the track when you're trying to do that. You could just leave the layout like this and operate it for many years as it is now, but I do plan to add some simple scenery to the layout. I took a Team Tracks paper model kit that I had downloaded, printed it out at 70% the original size so it would be roughly Z-scale, and then I'll use that to build a warehouse along the backdrop. I also plan to have just some generic loading areas between the front two tracks of the layout, and I'll add on some basic ground cover. I don't plan to add any trees or anything else that might easily break off, since it is a very portable layout, and I want to make it very easy to keep clean. And I also don't want to have little bits of scenery falling off randomly on my desk when I do move the layout around. Anyway, I'll have a video in the coming weeks once I have that additional work done. The very small size of this layout does allow you to operate it anywhere, and if you don't include the backdrop walls, you could easily just hang this layout on the wall when you aren't using it, store it on a bookshelf, under the bed, in a drawer, or really any other place as well. Small layouts like this are easy and fast to build, and they can allow you to run short operating sessions just about anywhere. Anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.